My name is Katherine. I'm 36 years old. And the night that destroyed everything wasn't when I ejected from a burning F-18 over the South China Sea, or when I completed my final classified mission with injuries that ended my Navy career at 32. It was standing in the Riverside Elementary cafeteria last month, listening to Principal Mrs. Davidson explain to the school board why they couldn't justify paying me more than minimum wage for emergency childcare. "She's just a babysitter," Davidson announced to 12 board members who controlled my pathetic paycheck, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never questioned her own importance. $12 an hour is generous for someone whose qualifications are AT limited. The murmurs of agreement hit like anti-aircraft fire. 12 people in business suits, measuring my worth against teenage babysitters while I stood there in my Target cardigan, absorbing their pity like someone who'd never achieved anything more significant than diaper changes and juice box distribution. But standing in that cafeteria, watching them debate whether I deserved $13 an hour instead of 12, I felt exactly like what they saw me as. A failure who'd never figured out how to build a real career. Tonight, I was just the woman they pitied for never finding a real career. The sidewalks of Millbrook looked like something out of a suburban lifestyle magazine, perfectly manicured lawns, German luxury cars in every driveway, and the kind of tree-lined streets where the biggest daily drama was deciding between organic quinoa and regular at Whole Foods. I pushed Emma's stroller along Maple Street at 9:30 a.m., the time when stay-at-home mothers emerged from their McMansions like synchronized swimmers, clutching Starbucks cups and designer handbags worth more than I made in 3 months. The morning ritual of suburban superiority, performed daily for audiences of neighbors who measured worth in brands and zip codes. "Look, it's Katherine," I heard Jennifer Morrison whisper to Susan Walsh as they converged near the mailboxes, their voices carrying clearly across manicured lawns despite their theatrical attempts at discretion. 36 and still babysitting," Susan replied, her tone mixing pity with satisfaction. "I heard the Hendersons only pay her $12 an hour. Can you imagine? Can you imagine?" While they discussed my hourly wage like it was evidence in a trial about personal failures, Emma babbled happily from her bugaboo stroller, the $1,500 baby transport system that cost more than my monthly rent, but was considered basic by Millbrook standards. The Henderson house sat on 2 acres of pristine Connecticut real estate, complete with circular driveway, 3-car garage, and the kind of architectural perfection that screamed we've made it to anyone driving past. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors while I knelt on Persian rugs worth more than my car, stacking wooden blocks with 2-year-old Emma and pretending not to notice how her parents looked at me. "Katherine's wonderful with the children," Mrs. Henderson would tell friends who asked about their childcare arrangements, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for discussing reliable household help. "She's very simple, uncomplicated. Perfect for basic childcare needs." Basic childcare needs. Simple, uncomplicated. The words they used to describe someone they assumed had never achieved anything more complex than diaper changes and juice box distribution. What they couldn't see, what I'd hidden deeper than any classified operation, was that the hands they watched fold tiny pajamas had once gripped the controls of an F-18 Super Hornet while flying combat air patrol over the Strait of Hormuz. That their simple babysitter had landed on aircraft carrier decks during storms that grounded pilots with twice my flight hours. But kneeling on their Persian rug, surrounded by toys that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I felt exactly like what they saw. A woman who'd never figured out how to build a real career, who'd settled for taking care of other people's children because she lacked the ambition to create anything meaningful of her own. The memory always hit the same way, sudden, complete, like afterburner ignition in my chest. 3 years ago, flying missions I couldn't discuss with anyone who didn't have clearance levels most Americans would never achieve. Lieutenant Commander Katherine Hayes, call sign Phoenix, leading airstrikes that prevented regional conflicts from becoming international disasters. Until the ejection seat over the South China Sea. Until the spinal injuries that made high-G maneuvers impossible. Until the medical retirement that transformed me from naval aviator into someone whose greatest achievement was keeping toddlers entertained while their parents attended charity galas and wine tastings. "Not everyone can handle this kind of work," Mr. Henderson told friends at dinner parties when they asked about their nanny situation. "It takes a special kind of person to be satisfied with simple responsibilities." Satisfied with simple responsibilities. While he'd been building his hedge fund empire in climate-controlled Manhattan offices, I'd been making split-second decisions that determined whether American servicemen came home to their families or came home in flag-draped coffins. But sitting in their living room at 7 p.m., surrounded by toys I'd organized and cleaned, watching Emma sleep peacefully in my arms while her parents discussed quarterly earnings and vacation home rentals, I couldn't access that former version of myself. Couldn't remember what it felt like to command respect through competence rather than earn minimal wages through availability and desperation. The nightmares had stopped months ago, but the isolation remained. Days measured in diaper changes and nap schedules, weeks defined by hourly wages that barely covered my studio apartment on the wrong side of Millbrook's carefully maintained class divide. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister in California. "How's the babysitting going? Still thinking about going back to school?" Going back to school. Like I was someone who'd dropped out of community college instead of someone who'd earned wings that fewer than 2% of military pilots ever achieved. Like my problem was lack of education rather than classified service records that made civilian career transitions impossibly complex. I typed back, "Good. Keeping busy." Keeping busy. While she was building her marketing career in San Diego, explaining my life to people who'd never understand that some transitions can't be measured in LinkedIn endorsements and resume improvements. The Hendersons returned home at 9:47 p.m., full of stories about their charity auction and the other couples who'd bid on Mediterranean cruises and art pieces that cost more than annual salaries. They paid me in cash $12 $20 bills and a handful of singles that brought my daily earnings to exactly what they'd spent on wine during their 3-hour dinner. "Same time tomorrow?" Mrs. Henderson asked, already heading toward the stairs without waiting for an answer. "Same time tomorrow. Same hourly wage. Same assumptions about my limited potential and basic qualifications." I walked home through Millbrook's perfectly lit streets, past houses where families slept safely behind alarm systems and automatic sprinkler systems, protected by police departments that handled noise complaints and parking violations rather than international terrorism and military threats. In my studio apartment, I sat on the couch I'd bought at Goodwill and stared at the shadow box I kept hidden in my closet. Navy Cross. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal with Gold Star. Decorations that told stories I couldn't share with people who measured achievement in PTA positions and book club leadership roles. The woman they pitied for settling for babysitting had once been someone whose courage kept them safe while they slept in beds I'd helped protect. But tomorrow, I'd push another stroller down another sidewalk while suburban mothers whispered about my failures and limitations, never knowing they were discussing someone who'd earned recognition they couldn't comprehend. The truth felt like classified information I was carrying without authorization, too dangerous to share, too heavy to carry, too important to abandon. 3 weeks later, when 28 children from Riverside Elementary found themselves 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean with hijackers in the cockpit, that truth would finally have permission to surface. But tonight, I was just Katherine, the babysitter, the woman who'd never achieved anything worth discussing at dinner parties. Some secrets are worth more than the people who refuse to learn them. Some truths wait for the right emergency to prove themselves. And sometimes, the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary circumstances, counting hours until their moment comes. The Henderson family's helicopter lifted off from Westchester County Airport at 9:15 a.m., climbing into September sky that stretched clear and blue toward the Hamptons. Inside the luxurious cabin, champagne glasses clinked while Emma and Thomas pressed their noses against windows, watching Connecticut suburbs shrink into miniature perfection below. "Look, Katherine," Emma squealed, pointing at cars that looked like toys crawling along highway ribbons. "We're so high." I smiled and adjusted her seatbelt, my hands steady despite the familiar sensation of being airborne again, the subtle vibration through the airframe, the change in air pressure, the particular rhythm of rotor blades cutting through atmosphere at 120 knots. Mrs. Henderson was already celebrating what she called their weekend escape from suburban monotony, while Mr. O.B. Henderson reviewed investment portfolios and discussed Hampton property values with their friends, the Mortons. The kind of casual wealth display that made $12 an hour childcare seem generous rather than exploitative. "Katherine's wonderful with basic supervision," Mrs. Henderson told Susan Morton, her voice carrying that tone reserved for discussing reliable household help. "Very calm, very uncomplicated." Uncomplicated. While she measured my qualifications in juice boxes and diaper changes, I was unconsciously calculating our airspeed, altitude, and heading with precision that came from years of navigating three-dimensional space under far more dangerous conditions. That's when the cabin door exploded inward. 3 men in black ski masks rushed the passenger compartment with military precision, automatic weapons raised, shouting commands that transformed luxury travel into life-or-death terror at 8,000 feet above Long Island Sound. "Nobody moves! This aircraft is under our control." The leader's voice cut through rotor noise like breaking glass. "Follow orders or everyone dies." Mrs. Henderson's scream pierced the cabin. "Mr." Henderson went corpse white, his tablet clattering to the floor as his hands shot above his head. The Morton couple huddled together like children hiding from thunderstorms, their Hampton weekend suddenly irrelevant compared to basic survival. "Please don't hurt the children," Mrs. Henderson begged, blood streaming from her nose after the lead hijacker struck her with his weapon. "Take anything you want, just..." "Shut up," he backhanded her again, sending her sprawling across leather seats while Emma started screaming and Thomas went silent with shock. Both children instinctively moved toward me, their small hands grabbing my arms like I was the only stable thing in a world that had just become completely unpredictable. Their trust hit me harder than any weapon, two kids who needed someone capable of protecting them when their parents couldn't. That's when everything inside me shifted. Not fear. Fear was for people who'd never been targeted by surface-to-air missiles. Not panic. Panic was luxury I couldn't afford when lives depended on competence under pressure. What shifted was muscle memory and tactical awareness that had been dormant for 3 years, suddenly activated by the sound of automatic weapons and the sight of children in danger. The lead hijacker was moving toward the cockpit, probably planning to force the pilot to divert to whatever destination they'd arranged. But he made a critical tactical error. He turned his back on the harmless babysitter to monitor the adults who looked like potential threats. I moved with precision that came from years of close-quarters combat training that most naval aviators received but prayed never to use. Strike to the solar plexus to disrupt breathing. Weapon disarmament through leverage and rotation. Control the firearm before he could recover. The hijacker hit the cabin floor hard, his weapon sliding across polished metal while I secured it and turned toward his partners, who were processing the impossible reality that their civilian target had just neutralized their team leader in under 4 seconds. "Katherine!" Mrs. Henderson screamed, not understanding what she was witnessing. The second hijacker swung his weapon toward me, but I was already moving, using the cabin's confined dimensions to my advantage. Training scenarios where hesitation meant death. The weapon discharged deafening in the enclosed space, but I was no longer where he'd aimed. By the time the third hijacker realized what was happening, I had control of 2 weapons and tactical superiority in terrain. I understood better than they did. "This is Lieutenant Commander Katherine Hayes." I spoke into the helicopter's radio with authority that cut through chaos like a surgical blade. "United States Navy, call sign Phoenix. Aircraft secure. 3 hostiles neutralized. Requesting immediate emergency landing clearance." "Navy, Lieutenant Commander." The words hit that cabin like explosive decompression, sucking away every assumption the Henderson family had made about their childcare provider. Air traffic control responded with professional efficiency. "Roger, Katherine Hayes. Emergency landing cleared. Vector 090 degrees, Republic Airport. Medical and tactical responders standing by." I moved to the pilot's seat. The civilian pilot was trained for wealthy passengers, not combat emergencies where lives hung in the balance. My hands found the controls with familiarity that came from thousands of flight hours in aircraft far more complex than this Robinson R-66. "Everyone hold on," I announced to passengers who were staring at me like I'd just transformed into someone else entirely. "We're going down fast and controlled." The approach compressed everything I'd learned about emergency procedures into 8 minutes of precisely managed descent through Long Island airspace. Auto-rotation protocols. Power management. Flare timing that meant the difference between landing and becoming a crater in Nassau County. The skids hit Republic Airport's runway, trailing sparks that lit up like fireworks, but we were down. Safe. Intact. Breathing. Emergency responders swarmed the aircraft. FBI hostage rescue. Nassau County SWAT. Paramedics expecting casualties who found instead traumatized but unharmed civilians. And 3 unconscious hijackers, zip-tied with restraints. I'd improvised from the helicopter's emergency kit. "You saved our children," Mrs. Henderson sobbed, throwing her arms around me while news helicopters circled overhead. "You saved all of us. We had no idea. We never knew." The story broke on every network simultaneously. Babysitter revealed as decorated naval aviator in helicopter hijacking. Within hours, my classified service record was being declassified for media consumption. Navy Cross recipient. Distinguished Flying Cross. Combat veteran of operations that had prevented regional conflicts from becoming international disasters. The simple babysitter was someone whose courage had protected American interests in ways her employers couldn't comprehend. That evening, as I stood on Republic Airport's tarmac with Emma and Thomas still clinging to my waist, surrounded by reporters and federal agents debriefing the incident, I could see the Millbrook mothers in the crowd, women who'd whispered about my failures now staring in stunned recognition. Jennifer Morrison stood behind police barriers, her mouth hanging open as CNN explained that the woman she'd mocked for never achieving anything had earned military decorations that most officers would never see. Susan Walsh was crying not from relief, but from shame so profound it had rendered her speechless. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, a reporter, called out, "What do you want to say to people who thought you were just a babysitter?" I looked at the cameras, at the crowd of neighbors who'd measured my worth in hourly wages and social acceptability, at the Henderson family who finally understood what kind of person they'd been employing for $12 an hour. "I was never just babysitting," I said, feeling Emma's small hand squeeze mine while Thomas leaned against my shoulder. "I was guarding lives. On aircraft carriers, in combat zones, and in your living rooms. The mission never changed, only the uniform." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous, sustained, the kind of recognition that comes from witnessing something that redefines your understanding of heroism. People standing not for the dramatic rescue, but for the recognition that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary circumstances, protecting us in ways we never notice until crisis reveals their true capabilities. The woman they'd pitied for settling had been serving all along. The babysitter they'd dismissed had been a guardian whose skills ensured that children, whether in war zones or suburban helicopters, made it home safely to families who would never fully understand what that protection had cost. My worth was never measured in milk bottles warmed or bedtime stories read. It was carved in the skies above hostile territory, written in mission reports that saved lives, proven in moments when competence under pressure meant survival instead of statistics. That day, when truth roared into the open at 8,000 feet, every lie about my limitations collapsed into the recognition that some people are born to stand between danger and innocence, whether that innocence sleeps in Navy bunks or suburban cribs. Because protecting children was never about the paycheck. It was about the promise that someone somewhere would always be watching the sky. Katherine's story reminds us that worth isn't measured by job titles or hourly wages, that heroes often work quietly in the most ordinary roles, and that the people we dismiss based on their current circumstances might be carrying stories of courage that would humble us if we bothered to ask. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated based on your job, or if you've realized you might be making assumptions about people's worth based on what they do for work, share this video. Let it reach someone who needs to know their past achievements matter, even when their present doesn't look impressive to others. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, the veterans rebuilding their lives in civilian careers, the service members whose greatest achievements happened before you knew them, the people whose quiet strength protects us in ways we never notice until crisis reveals their true capabilities. Because the most important question isn't what someone does for work today. It's whether you're wise enough to recognize that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary places, doing necessary work while carrying stories that would change how you see them forever. Share this story with someone who's ever been judged by their current job, who's rebuilding after military service, or who deserves recognition for protecting others in ways that don't show up on resumes. I was never just babysitting. I was guarding lives on the ground and in the air.